G'day, mate. 40 here. I took a 2-week break from live streaming, and it was so good for the central nervous system. It was so good for my thinking. Instead, I've just been devoting myself to blogging rather than live streaming, and you get a lot more depth and intellectual coherence when you simply devote yourself to writing as opposed to live streaming, when you're much more in a world of immediate reactions to stimuli. So doing this, live streaming about current events, giving your opinions on what's going on in the world, it's so unhealthy. Now, some people can do it, but particularly if you're on the right, particularly if you are a dissident with regard to institutions and to the mainstream media, right, the pressure is overwhelming to side with conspiracy theories, because what else are you going to offer if all you can do is repeat what the elite institutions are telling you? Then you're not adding any value. So there's such a huge incentive to direct yourself towards conspiracy theories, which is not ideal. Now, why would you want to listen to this stream? And I think number one reason should be I aim for truth optimizing. So almost everyone else who's commenting on this war, they are not primarily aiming for truth optimization. They are primarily aiming for supporting their end of the alliance and doing war with the enemies of their alliance. Now, my life is a long history of alliance failures. I so prize my independence to say what I think that I always have to keep a certain distance between myself and my alliances. And it's painful being in this position of neutrality, because when people attack you, you then don't have an alliance and a tribe that rallies to your side. And people tend to be suspicious of those who don't have an alliance, and you will inevitably get attacked, which is exactly what the Gulf states are experiencing right now. So all those Gulf states surrounding Iran, they tried to be neutral. They tried to stay out of this war. They publicly said they didn't want this war. And yet, despite all of that, they're getting hit hard by Iran, because the way the world works is group focused, right? The group strategy will usually outcompete an individualist strategy, and trying to pretend to be neutral, trying to rise above it all, trying to say, oh, I'm a truth optimizer. There are a handful of people in the world who want to optimize for truth, but they are tiny. They don't exactly constitute a tribe. And the only evolutionary reproductive fitness reason that you'd want to optimize for truth about events on the other side of the world is as a status play. And so if you successfully do a status play, then you get more resources, which can lead to reproductive fitness. But if you're like me and say, hey, what I'm doing now by trying to optimize for truth is a status play, then you're undercutting any ability to gain status, because usually you will only gain status if you pretend not to care about status. It's social paradox. We call those with charisma charismatic because they are so good at the social paradox, notes David Pinsof, right? They pretend to not care about status. They pretend to be independent. They pretend not to care what you think. And these are all effective ways of mastering social paradoxes so that you gain in social status and you appear very charismatic. So I'm not an expert on Iran, but because I do notice some things about how the news is produced and how opinions are produced and how alliances work, I think I can decode much of the rhetoric around this war, and therefore I have something to say. And one thing that jumps out at me right away is that in the long-running conflict between Iran and Israel, there is one dramatic asymmetry, and that is Iran's elites are consistently getting slaughtered, and Israel's elites are not getting slaughtered. So apparently, Israel wiped out 40 of Iran's top leaders in a strike that killed the Ayatollah Khameini. There has been no such effective strike by Iran on Israel. Israel has been killing off Iran's nuclear scientists for about 2 decades. There has been no such targeting successfully of Israeli elites. So we have Israeli civilians who have been killed in this latest Iran war. We now have at least 3 American service members who have been killed. But we see Iran's top political and military elite getting decapitated on the battlefield, and the United States and Israel have not lost their elite leadership. So there is this stark asymmetry. Right? Iran's elites are getting wiped out, decapitated, murdered, killed, taken off the map. Same thing is not happening so far to Israel and the United States. I think this is a major factor in this war that, hey, is not getting a lot of commentary. So this is Michael Doran of the Hudson Institute, and this interview was recorded 3 days before this war got started.
Because the Abraham Accords, the normalization of ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, went against everything that John Kerry said was possible to do. So they were really upset about it. So I said, okay, if those guys are no longer for peace and security, then we can be.
Yeah, they hate this because it worked, right? They hate it because Trump came up with changed the game, and it actually seems to be working. It was working better than anything they've had before. But now, yeah, before I get to what's happening in Iran, when the last time Trump bombed Iran, which seemed to be one of the great military missions of all time. I mean, it seemed simple, it seemed difficult, but they pulled it off so brilliantly, and it did set back their nuclear project. I remember Tucker Carlson clasping his heart because he had said, this is going to be the beginning of World War III, and he let go of the sigh. And the other day, Tucker Carlson was on with Mike Huckabee, a guy I really like and respect, and he's a fairly decent guy. And I felt Huckabee was a little bit blindsided by the pure, venomous anti-Semitic hatred that now just comes off of Tucker like smoke. Now, you wrote a piece about this interview, which was really interesting because it showed how much Tucker distorts things. What was your take on listening to that conversation?
Well, my take was that Mike Huckabee walked into a buzzsaw. He didn't really understand what the game was because he's a decent guy, because he's known Tucker for 30 years, and for many other reasons, he thought this was going to be a normal interview where he, as the guy who's at the center of this storm right now, I mean, this potential war with Iran. Huckabee's there in all the meetings between the president and the prime minister of Israel. Huckabee thought that Tucker would ask him questions, give him time to answer, would be genuinely interested in what his answers were. But what really happened is that Tucker staged a little political theater, and he cast Huckabee in a particular part, and he wouldn't let Huckabee break out of that part. And the part that Huckabee was to play was the
Right, you really have to know what game you're playing, and so if an interview is in good faith, you conduct yourself one way. If it's not in good faith, then you have to adapt and conduct yourself differently.
Was the dishonest representative of a corrupt elite that refuses to admit that the government is really controlled by the Jews. Or, Tucker would say, I never said that, just some Jews, right? Some Jews have access that no normal citizen has. And so he peppered Huckabee with all kinds of questions that you would never ask any other ambassador. Why haven't the Epstein files been released? What about Israel is harboring pedophiles? Nobody goes to the ambassador, Charles Kushner, Trump's ambassador to France, and says, "How come France lets what was his name? The director of Chinatown, famous
yes,
Roman Polanski. How come Switzerland and France? Why are you harboring Roman Polanski? Or anyway, all of this was because Tucker knows that his audience believes that.
So, do you think it's important that the asymmetry in whose elites are getting slaughtered is just so dramatic, right? It's Iran's elites who've been getting slaughtered, not just in this war, but in the previous war and in the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel. And the asymmetry just strikes me as incredibly dramatic. It's incredibly one-sided. So I've been noticing over the past 2 weeks without live streaming how my central nervous system is just rewired. What I'm doing right now, doing a live stream, is all about performance. And blogging is about composition. and coherence and development. So when you live stream, you're in social combat mode, right? You're scanning for reaction, you're anticipating pushback, you're sharpening your attacks, you're working on your timing, you're primed for a status exchange. Even if the audience is friendly, it's still all about coalition signaling in real time. You feel watched, you feel monitored, you have adrenaline, you're working on your verbal speed, your punchiness, your sharp takes. But you blog for 50 hours a week, as I've been doing the last 2 weeks, you move into architect mode, right? You're building a structure of thought. You're developing ideas. You slow down. You tolerate ambiguity. You revise. You connect threads. You strive for coherence, not applause. You get wired towards integration instead of performance. Right? Very different effect on your central nervous system. So live streaming strengthens your instinct, your rhetorical aggression. It tends to flatten nuance. It can sharpen clarity. It rewards speed and emotional resonance. Blogging strengthens depth, coherence, synthesis. It reduces spontaneity. It increases precision. It rewards patience and structural thinking. And you just feel the difference between blogging and live streaming in your body. Live streaming feels electric. It's outward facing. You're scanning for other people's views and how what you say might affect your life, years down the road. Blogging, right? It feels grounded. It feels inward. It feels primarily intellectual. You feel like you're building something with a long shelf life. You feel like you're creating compound interest. You're building infrastructure. Now, with live streaming, you feel like you may be building audience loyalty and some parasocial energy and momentum. You're reactive. You're scanning for reactions, for headlines, comments. You sharpen your edges. You're incentivized to reward speed, confidence, and emotional depth, emotional charge. Now, depth is possible, but the structure is always pulling you back towards performance. And blogging just flips this incentive stack. You're accountable to coherence. Something is sloppy, it stares back at you on the screen. You can't hide behind tone or charisma, right? You either make the argument work or you don't. It seems much healthier mentally, particularly if you want intellectual integration rather than just stimulation. Live streaming ties your central nervous system to real-time social feedback, which can inflate you or deflate you. Blogging is much quieter. The dopamine release is much slower. It's more durable. Now, pure writing will lead you towards isolation, right? You can become precise, but disconnected. The audience energy, when handled well, can sharpen you and keep you more socially realistic, socially situated. Okay, so one thing I'm noticing is that no expert is finding anything surprising in this Iran war. Notice that every single expert on X elsewhere is simply finding their priors confirmed. So whether the expert was leaning against the war, for the war, pro-Iran, pro-Israel, I'm unaware of one single expert right now who's willing to admit that they're surprised by what's going down. And that strikes me as interesting. How long will it be until we start getting experts admitting that they are surprised by this or that development? You'd think that would have to be coming down the pike soon. All right, let's get a hit from Fox News.
Who are now stranded overseas, especially in the Middle East, as they are able to do. There are about 300,000 Americans on the ground in the Mideast, living there, traveling there at any given moment in time, and it is for good reason. Take a look at the worldwide caution alert, as you mentioned, still in effect for Americans everywhere in the world today. Following the launch of U.S. combat operations in Iran, Americans worldwide, especially the Mideast, should follow the guidance in the latest security alerts issued by the nearest U.S. embassy or consulate. That is key. Overnight, hundreds of Iraqis attempted to storm Baghdad's fortified Green Zone.
So one area where I find expert commentary deficient right now is that it seems like the dominant frame that the experts are using on the Iran war is Donald Trump. And if they like Donald Trump, they frame things in a positive light. And if they don't like Donald Trump, then they frame this Iran war as an absolute disaster. I am a structuralist. I think structures are usually far more important than personalities. And so, however I feel about Donald Trump, it doesn't really have much effect on how I try to understand this war, and it shouldn't. The structure of this war is far more important than how you feel about Donald Trump. But when I look at the New York Times and the Financial Times and other elite media, these are the cliches that I see, right? This is Trump's decision. This is Trump's choice. Let's debate Trump's stated rationales as though the explicit literal reasons that Donald Trump is giving for this intervention are what's important. Let's look at historical analogies with regard to Trump's prior interventions or Trump's views on prior interventions. Let's make predictions based on our read of Donald Trump's character. It seems to be overwhelmingly framed through how people look at Donald Trump. And anyone who does that, it just reduces any trust that I have in their expertise. Right? If people hate Donald Trump or think he's reckless, then they see this as a reckless war. And if people love Donald Trump, then they see it as a necessary war. But if you're framing this primarily through the lens of your reaction to Donald Trump, that strikes me as just a clearly inferior way to understand what's happening. Right? We have a structure that's going on of war. And the expert class, they seem to be primarily signaling how much they hate Donald Trump, rather than just being fair dinkum and analyzing this war on its own merits.
Consulate in Pakistan. U.S. military bases across the Middle East are facing retaliatory attacks. This could be one, as I stated. The State Department has issued new guidance warning Americans all over the globe to exercise increased caution, especially if you're in the Middle East. Former FBI Assistant Director Chris Swecker.
If ever there's going to have a Hezbollah cell or a Hamas cell act in the United States in a violent way, it's now, because their back's against the wall. So the FBI is going real time with all of their.
So I would expect that there have been Iranian kill squads in the United States for decades. So I would expect domestic terror attacks. Okay, everyone has been predicting the Iran war for the last 20 years. What about the implication for Cuba? Right? How does that calculation change after the Venezuela operation and the Iran war? Well, I would think that there'd be some sort of regime change in Cuba just on its own merits without any regard to this Iran conflict. Also, we have indications that Putin's willing to accept U.S. security guarantees. So we seem to be closer to a resolution to the Ukraine war than ever before. And I noticed so many cliches dominating coverage of this Iran war, and one of them is an air war can't bring about regime change. Well, we've already had a regime change in Iran. The top leaders have been killed. There is a new regime in power. As of yet, there's no indication that this new regime is any less anti-American. But regimes change all the time, right? Different people with power get more power or less power. We are seeing regime change, and it seems to be ongoing as more and more Iranian elites are killed. That's going to constantly force changes in the Iranian regime. And I'm just thinking of Iran's top 10,000 most powerful players. Right? How many are willing to die for the Islamist regime? Right? At what point do the incentives shift so that you have a better chance of living and surviving and flourishing and gaining status and power if you change your alignment away from the Islamist regime? The Islamist regime only has the support of about 15% of the population. You would think that that these precise targeted attacks taking out Iran's leaders would provide incentives for a regime change against the anti-American attitude that dominates currently. All right, this is Michael Doran from February 25.
American institutions no longer represent them. They're unaccountable and unelected powers that.
So Jews in America really threw in their lot with American institutions. They've frequently risen to the top of American institutions, but now that the anti-institution movement is gaining power in the United States, it's not good for Jews. So Jews need to develop an independent agency outside of America's dominant institutions.
Get concentrated. They represent concentrations of unelected and unaccountable power, and he is putting a face on those concentrations of power. The face is the Jews, the Israelis, and he wouldn't let Huckabee get out of that frame. Huckabee didn't really realize that was what he was up against, and so he scored some points against Tucker, I think, but Tucker's audience saw what Tucker wanted them to see, and anyone who was inclined to see the anti-Semitism that Tucker that Tucker represents already knew that, and so I don't think either one of them changed any.
So Donald Trump is incredibly transactional, and I think overall that's a good thing. You have more in common when you build on the basis of common interests rather than common values, because common values are incredibly amorphous, and it is a far better, far more secure bet to weigh in on the side of common interests rather than common values. I think that Asian countries are much more pragmatic and interested in making alliances based on common interests rather than common values. So I don't think that Donald Trump launched this war against Iran on the basis of common values. I don't think that Donald Trump is naive. I think he's incredibly transactional. And I don't see any evidence that he launched this war on the basis of the Israel lobby. And I don't see any evidence that Donald Trump is swayed by ideology, swayed by Christian teachings about Jews, etc. So I've long noticed that Donald Trump has an incredibly pragmatic relationship to Jews and to every other group. I remember him saying many decades ago that he wanted short guys with little hats to manage his money. So I think that like all groups, right, Jews have strengths and weaknesses, and Donald Trump seems keenly aware of Jewish strengths and weaknesses, and he sees it as in America's interest to remove an enemy regime that has been terrorizing the Middle East and prevent it from developing a nuclear program and ICBMs. So you have a president who's transactional, you have a president who's situational, you have a president who will switch allies at the drop of the hat. And I see absolutely no evidence that Trump is deferring to the Israel lobby, right? I think he's making a strategic calculation. I'm not pro this Iran war. I'm not opposed to it either. I'm standing here just pursuing the truth, mate.
In barrels last year through that strait. Oil prices had been surging ahead of the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran. Here is Fox Business contributor Phil Flynn.
President Trump gets that energy policy is strength. And if you're controlling energy, you can control the world, you can control the global economy. And China is one of our biggest adversaries. I mean, they've been keeping our adversaries in business, right? Importing oil from Russia. They're importing oil from Iran, and they were from Venezuela as well. And almost a quarter of their daily imports were coming from countries that were opposed to us. And they were keeping the divisions in these countries going.
That's an interesting bit of information. Enemies working together. Jackie D'Angelo's co-host of the Big Money Show on.
So I have not generally won the alliance game over the course of my life. My early childhood was turbulent, and I think I developed a fear of throwing in my lot too one-dimensionally with any alliance, and so I would not recommend my life path for anyone. It's very painful. The advantage of my life path is that I've positioned myself to have a large amount of freedom to say what I truly believe. So, for example, a normal Orthodox Jew is usually tied to a particular rabbi. And at times I've been tied to a particular rabbi, but there is a big disadvantage if you're going to be a blogger or a vlogger if you're tied to a particular rabbi, because then anyone who objects to what you're saying can just go to that rabbi, put pressure on him, and it can shut you down. So I've learned that I have to keep some distance between myself and the community or any particular rabbi so that I can maximize my freedom. On the other hand, I need some freedom, some connection in my life. So I am willing to sacrifice some degree of freedom for that connection. But I do revel in the ability to say what I think is going on in the world. And here is a cliche that I've received throughout my life from people who are much more institutionally embedded than myself, from teachers, from elites, from professionals. That they keep telling me, I know things that you do not know. And I'm willing to, let's just grant that 100% of the time that is true. But in my experience, at least half the time, this special knowledge has not been decisive. And I'm not at all convinced that the special hidden knowledge that perhaps undergirds this American attack on Iran is decisive. I think it's at least 50% possible that an outsider may see this situation more clearly and more decisively than those with the special institutional knowledge. So all the time people have told me, oh, I know things that you don't know. For example, in something like September of 2015, I started taking Donald Trump seriously and thinking that he was very likely to win the Republican nomination. And I'd have friends who'd tell me, oh, I know things that you do not know. Well, I'm sure they knew things that I did not know, but those things that they knew were not decisive, right? So you can know special things. You can be privy to information and to negotiation and to what's going on in the boardroom and all sorts of hidden knowledge, but that doesn't mean that you're right. And so you may very well see this Iran war more clearly and more decisively than those with all the special knowledge. And so I know things that you don't know is usually a status claim. It's a boundary marker. It's telling you that you are lower than your interlocutor in the hierarchy. I've gone to Shabbat meals where children in Jewish day schools have told me, well, I'm on a higher madrega than you. I'm on a higher spiritual Jewish level than you are. And these are unverifiable claims. They're unfalsifiable. You can't check them. You can't find objective evidence one way or another. So you get these expert claims all the time as a black box that you can't audit. And so the choice is, do you give deference to these claims? Right? Just because someone is more institutionally embedded than you doesn't mean they're right. Just because someone knows things that you don't know doesn't mean that they're right. Just because they have more status, prestige, and hierarchy than you doesn't mean that they're right. Right? Often, these intimate, embedded institutional relationships blind you. Right? Outsiders will often see things more clearly. They'll see incentive structures more clearly. They'll notice contradictions more clearly. They will see operational constraints more clearly than insiders. So it's not at all clear that insiders just see things more clearly than outsiders. Not at all clear that outsiders see things more clearly than insiders. This is why I'm not populist and I'm not elitist. Sometimes the elites are right and sometimes the populists are right. And it's not at all clear that this black box institutional hidden knowledge is going to be decisive for understanding how the Iran war turns out. Think about all these examples where insiders were wrong and the outsiders had superior and more decisive clarity. The Vietnam War, you had all these U.S. intelligence and military leaders and political leaders claiming that outsiders didn't understand what was happening, that America really was winning. Well, the outsiders who were critical of the war were right, and the insiders were wrong. The Bay of Pigs and the various crises with Cuba, right? Outsiders often saw the situation far more clearly than the insiders. The 2003 Iraq invasion premised on the basis of weapons of mass destruction claims. Well, independent analysts saw this far more clearly than the insiders. 2008 financial crisis, many outsiders saw this more clearly than the insiders. So someone tells you, oh, I know things that you don't know. You don't have to bow down to them.
Any minds.
So I don't want to stay on this forever, but there are two questions I want to ask you about it. And the reason I want to ask you is people in the audience who don't know who you are famously have only one motive in your Middle East commentary, which is the good of the United States. You've said this repeatedly. It drives people crazy about you. People hate you for it. But you have always said you want the things in the Middle East to go in such a way that they help America. So
I want the U.S. to be the top dog. That's
top
all
dog.
I want.
Yes, and it's pretty obvious from everything you write. So two things. one of the moments that just appalled me was when Tucker started going on and on about how he would never kill a 14-year-old, even if that 14-year-old was pointing a machine gun at his family. I mean, he's such a phony. And he accused Mike Huckabee, of all people, of supporting the killing of children. Can you explain to the audience why that's nonsense?
It's nonsense because he's talking about Hamas in Gaza,
Right.
and one of the claims against Israel is that it's carrying out a genocide in Gaza. It's not.
I started blogging on a regular basis. First blog post that I ever made was on AOL, July 3, 1997, and I've broken a lot of news stories on my blog. And I found that the professional class has usually not accepted, not believed my news stories because they weren't backed up by institutions. And sometimes institutions have more clarity and more wisdom and more knowledge and better information than that which is offered by outsiders such as myself. But just as often, outsiders have more knowledge than institutions, or are more decisive and accurate about what's really going on. So as an outsider and somewhat adventurous bloke, I can operate out where the buses don't run no more, and I am willing to break news that doesn't have official pieces of paper backing up my reports. Now, what you get in the mainstream media is reporting on what institutions have decided and released based on official pieces of paper, right? The normal LA Times, New York Times, BBC approach is that news is not news until there is an official paper supporting this information. And so until an institution comes along to confirm what I'm saying, the professional class tends to deny my reports. Now, yesterday, for about 5 hours, the BBC kept saying that Iran had reported that the Ayatollah would be speaking live. And because Iran had said that the Ayatollah would be speaking live, the reports that the Ayatollah was dead were false. Like, why was the BBC so naive as to trust the Iranians? Just because the Iranians say that the Ayatollah is going to be speaking live provides zero evidence that the Ayatollah is going to be speaking live. People, not just Iranians, but also non-Iranians, rarely say what they mean, and people rarely mean what they say. So the BBC approach and the New York Times approach is that until an official channel, an official institution has said something, it's not true. But there was growing evidence from all sorts of different sources that the Ayatollah was dead prior to the Iranian state recognizing and stating that the Ayatollah was dead. Right? So it's just kind of weird that people wait for Iran to declare something before they accept that it's true. I remember in February of 2007, I made a blog post that the mayor of Los Angeles had not been wearing his wedding ring for about 7 months. And other journalists in LA knew this story, but they weren't going to write it. One, because they were all on board with the Latino mayor. They thought it was great that Los Angeles finally had a Latino mayor, and they didn't want to talk about murky, gossipy, personal stuff like a marriage that was unraveling. And so they just avoided the story until my blog post made it impossible for them to avoid the story. And then it eventually became perhaps the #1 story in California that year. I remember I reported that Mark Wallace was likely patient zero of an HIV outbreak in the heterosexual porn industry. I think I did this in early 1998. And all these pornographers said, oh, I don't believe that's true because official sources haven't said that it's true. And remember the Trump assassination attempt in July of 2024? It took about 5 or 6 hours for network news to say that this had been an assassination attempt. But anyone with any knowledge of guns could have heard the shot, seen the video, heard the shot, and recognized that this was an assassination attempt. And so it's one approach. You wait until the FBI or some official source declares something. But it strikes me this is pretty poor epistemics, that there are frequently far more effective and far timelier ways of assessing what's going on in the world than waiting for official sources.
Not true, because Israel is fighting a terrorist army. A terrorist army puts its own civilians between it and its enemy and uses its own civilians as human shields. A democratic army puts its army between its civilians and its enemy. It's as simple as that. You are violating rules of war when you behave like a terrorist army, and the death of civilians is on you morally. It's not on the democratic army that is trying to defend itself.
So there was a communications professor who wrote a review of the new journalism of Joan Didion and compared it to the reporting of the New York Times with regard to what was happening in El Salvador. And she wrote this review in something like 1983. And in the review, she said that news derives from the passage of bureaucratically recognized events through administrative procedures. Right? That is the pattern of the mainstream news. And that's why you come to things like podcasts and live streams and blogs and social media, because you find this inadequate. Right? It is clearly an inadequate way of understanding what's going on. So an explosion only becomes a terrorist attack when a security agency says so. A shooting only becomes an assassination attempt when law enforcement uses that term. Right? A leader is only dead when a government confirms that a leader is dead, until it's just reports or claims or unconfirmed. Right? The way the mainstream media works is to depend on what bureaucracies say. Right? It's an administrative epistemology as opposed to an experiential or inferential epistemology. And so this makes the news media look deferential to power, slow, out of touch. Right? Joe Biden was obviously cognitively impaired at times from 2017 onward, but the mainstream media would not report that until after his disastrous debate with Donald Trump, June 27 of 2024. So anyone just looking at video of Joe Biden would have seen that this man is clearly impaired. But because you didn't have an official institution stating it, journalists just wanted to ignore that. Then you have elite media calling pregnant women birthing people. Right? Birthing people. Because public health agencies and medical journals and university DEI policies and various advocacy organizations said you shouldn't call pregnant women, you should call them birthing people. Or you shouldn't call the homeless, you should call them the unhoused. And so the elite mainstream media is embedded inside of institutions like NGOs and universities and public health authorities, and they tend to mimic the language and the platforms of these other institutions, right? They love that kind of elite language. So to a regular person, pregnant women is just a plain description. But to institutional actors, right, birthing people, that's more precise and inclusive. And so elite journalists tend to be highly sensitive to professional and bureaucratic norms. And they import terminology from these other expert communities. And it makes their language drift in ways that just feels alien, which is why people have less and less trust in the mainstream media.
The Hamas has tunnels under every structure in Gaza. It puts snipers on the top of every building. The only way, and it does not care about the killing of civilians, just like the Iranians don't care about the killing of their civilians, or they mow down civilians with glee. It doesn't bother them a bit to do that. When you're up against an enemy like that, there's no way you can destroy it.
So elites, particularly in the news media, but in NGOs, have just been absolutely focused on civilian deaths in Gaza. But these very same elites had very little interest in civilian deaths among protesters in Iran. Right? How come there are no institutions that showed a similar level of interest in civilian deaths in Gaza and protester deaths in Iran? Because there's no evolutionary reproductive fitness reason why people would care about deaths among outgroups on the other side of the world. Ergo, when you hear moral outrage on this score, it's all about alliance signaling, who you're allied with, and status seeking. And if you do your alliance signaling and your status seeking right, then you do get resource gains, which can lead to more reproductive fitness. So the activists and the media outlets that focused on civilian deaths in Gaza, they had a particular agenda, which is why they pushed it. It was overwhelmingly a left-wing, anti-Western, anti-Israel agenda, and the Gaza civilian deaths fit inside that frame. And they simply weren't interested in Iranian deaths. And then on the right, people who hated institutional Islam or the Islamist regime of Iran, they focused on the deaths of civilian protesters, and they weren't nearly as interested in the deaths of Gaza protesters. So institutions write for coalitions. The New York Times writes for a particular alliance. The BBC produces news for a particular alliance. So Gaza is tightly linked to US and European domestic politics in a way that Iranian protest deaths are not. Also, Gaza had more footage available, more on-the-ground correspondence, a more visible battlefield, and so action video contains a compelling quality that the coverage of the protester deaths in Iran simply could not provide nearly as much. But when you hear the news, when you hear commentary, when you hear institutions proclaiming about events on the other side of the world, ask yourself, what alliance are they embedded in? Whose interests are they trying to support, and who's the enemy that they are trying to diminish?
Without killing some civilians. Of course, it is your duty to protect your own civilians.
And the chat says, come on, man. People care more about the actions of supposedly democratic allies than autocratic enemies. This is very dishonest. No, why? There is no evolutionary advantage to caring about the actions of supposedly democratic allies or autocratic enemies. So the only reason that you would care about this is a status play and to signal what alliance you're on. There's no pragmatic interest why an American would care about either deaths in Gaza or deaths in Afghanistan or deaths in Iran unless they felt themselves part of an alliance that was at war and they wanted to diminish their enemy and to support their own side. Or they wanted to signal how morally elevated they were, make a status play. There's no pragmatic reason. There's no evolutionary reproductive fitness reason why you would care about deaths on the other side of the world, unless you're making a status play or an alliance play.
So innocent lives are going to die. But the entire Western world, the entire world should be saying clearly that Hamas.
And the chat says, well, why don't the people protesting Alex Pretty's shooting go protest a domestic homicide instead? Same reasoning apply. There's absolutely no reason, unless you're connected to Alex Pretty, that you would get all upset about his shooting death, unless you're making an alliance play or a status play. And there's no reason why you would care about a homicide on the other side of the United States, unless you're making an alliance play or a status play. So the only reason people get outraged about these things is political and status, because there's no evolutionary fitness advantage in getting all concerned about what's happening on the other side of the country that doesn't pragmatically affect you.
Hamas is responsible for every death in Gaza.
So
what a moral collapse by you. Well, you evolved, you're part of a species that evolved. And if your moral preening conveys no reproductive evolutionary fitness, it is just preening and playing and angling and seeking status. And so the only way that you'll get additional resources by getting all morally outraged by something that has no pragmatic effect on your life is if you feel like you can gain status from doing this, or you feel like you can benefit your alliance and hurt the enemy of your alliance in political terms. So I am seeking status by optimizing for truth. And you are seeking status by trying to further your political agenda and by trying to appear particularly moral. We're both playing status games.
Another question is this. You were in the government under Bush. You were, Netanyahu, and to Tucker's horror, Netanyahu and Trump seem to really get along. Netanyahu visits often. Are the Jews controlling America?
Well, you're of Jewish origin, so
nobody asked me anything.
You're part of the cabal. Didn't we establish that the last time I came on?
I know. I wish I can't.
couple of years ago, I stumbled on an idea that has never left me, and that is that war results from differing reads on reality. So if everyone saw the same balance of power between Iran, Israel, and the United States, there would be no reason to go to war because you'd already know the outcome. You only get war because different parties see a different balance of outcome. So the US and Israel sees that Iran's leaders can be killed, that its air defenses can be penetrated, that its economy is strained, that its proxies are degraded. So striking Iran now, it looks like an act of strength, locking an advantage before Iran can rebuild its deterrence and cross a nuclear threshold. On the other hand, Iran didn't reach a deal with the US because it sees itself as strategically resilient, that it has missile depth, it has regional proxies, it can threaten shipping lanes and energy markets, it can impose long-term attritional costs. Iran believes the US lacks the appetite for a prolonged war and that Israel lacks the ability to sustain a prolonged war. There's also the timing component. If Israel believes that Iran is approaching a nuclear capability or any kind of military capability that would dramatically shift the balance of power, delay is costly. If Iran believes that its strategic position improves with time, then waiting is rational. So it's these different reads on reality, these different expectations about the trajectory of the balance of power that has created the incentives that have led to this war.
Can't even control like my car. I don't
Tucker,
Who's winning? I don't know, because usually when something's hard to read, the heuristic that I use is look at people who are not aligned in a particular direction. What way are they now leaning? Or are people changing their mind? Right now, no expert in this conflict has changed his mind. Right? Every expert says, oh, this war so far is simply confirming my priors. So until people start shifting in response to real-time events, I just don't have a heuristic for who's winning. Now, I emotionally have a side. I emotionally want America to win. I emotionally do not like the Islamist regime of Iran. But just looking at truth optimization, I can't see, oh, it's clear that one side is winning, or it's clear that this is a good or a bad decision by Donald Trump.
I just called you Tucker. Drew, it's so ridiculous that the reality is the exact opposite of what Tucker Carlson is saying. Israel is a small, vulnerable country with incredibly outsized talents. It's a cyber superpower. You know, there are 5 cyber superpowers in the world: China, Russia, the United States, Britain, and Israel. So Israel's punching way above its league. And man for man, in terms of their cyber forces, the Israelis are the best, because they have all of these brilliant kids around the country. They're tested by the military before they go in the military. If they test well for capabilities that would succeed in the cyber forces of the military.
So because Israel is a small, vulnerable country, it has to be incredibly pragmatic and rooted in reality. And Israeli society is structured so that status goes to how well you serve the country. Pretty much everybody has to serve in the armed forces, and your career trajectory and your lifelong status is usually deeply tied into how effectively you served the country, particularly through military service. One of the stupidest comments that I hear over the past few years is, what's wrong with Tucker? Why has Tucker gone crazy? Tucker Carlson has not gone crazy. Tucker is simply skating towards the puck, where the puck is going. Tucker has noticed that there's a growing populist, nationalist, dominant component of MAGA that is skeptical of American institutions. And because American Jews are particularly embedded in American institutions, and because American institutions have led to all sorts of useless overseas wars, that there is a growing Jew skeptical, Israel skeptical component of MAGA, and Tucker is following those incentives, as are Candace Owens and the other components of MAGA who are increasingly Israel skeptical or anti-Israel. So why does Candace Owens put forward these outrageous conspiracy theories about Erica Kirk? Because it titillates and tantalizes and attracts an audience. And so too with Tucker, right? You have to look at what he gains by staking out a line on Iran that is different from President Trump, right? So Tucker is saying, oh, this war against Iran, it's evil, it's catastrophic, it's terrible. Why is he saying this? It's not because he's optimizing for truth, right? He is simply skating to where he sees the puck is going, right? He can claim that he speaks for a larger slice of MAGA in the right-wing nationalist populist audience than other commentators and other politicians. So he can say he represents the interests of the American people against the elites who are pushing for a military escalation at the request of a foreign power. So he gets to differentiate himself from Mark Levin or Lindsey Graham or the neocons. So he gets to position himself as the anti-war voice that sets up a wedge between the conservative media and the dominant populist nationalist component of MAGA. So he believes this will build him a larger and more intensely loyal following. And he can cast himself as an independent critic of both the foreign policy establishment and of what Donald Trump is doing. So he's seeking to solidify, intensify, and expand his coalition. He positions himself as a defender of the America First movement, and he frames his rivals as people who are selling out American interests for Israel's interests. He gets to challenge the intelligence regarding Iran's nuclear capabilities. He can highlight internal rifts within the Trump administration. He can ally with Qatar or Saudi Arabia and other powerful international interests. And he can target his former employer, Fox News, for pushing a pro-war narrative. So he has all these incentives to consolidate his influence over younger GOP voters, to consolidate his alliance with the institutional, skeptical, populist, nationalist component of MAGA. He can signal that he is the true representative of the MAGA movement, and he can make his rivals look bad. So Tucker Carlson is strongly opposed to this war because that serves his interests.
They give them the option to go in. Every smart kid who is given that.
Luke, have you watched Tyler Oliveira's recent videos on Lakewood and other growing Orthodox enclaves? 5 million views in a week about a Jewish takeover. Yes, I have watched it. I expect a lot more of it, particularly after you saw, was it Nick Shirley doing that video on welfare fraud in Minnesota? That you'd expect influencers to go into Orthodox Jewish enclaves that use a disproportionate amount of welfare. And I try to be generally dispassionate and disinterested and neutral observer of the various sects within Orthodox Judaism, but I really hate any sect in Orthodox Judaism or outside of Orthodox Judaism, Jewish or non-Jewish sect, that depends for its way of life on milking a welfare system, right? I hate that. I hate it when Jews do it. I hate it when non-Jews do it. So to the extent that this reporting is fair and accurate, I think it's doing valuable work. And I really hate all these different groups taking advantage of America and not acting in the American interest.
That option wants to take it because he knows that if he does that, he can go on and become a millionaire or a billionaire.
Chat says, isn't it Trump's modus operandi? If something isn't working, shake the box, remove the old head of state, get a new head of state that might deal with him more effectively. Yes, Trump is incredibly pragmatic and transactional. And if Trump thinks he can make a new deal with the new leaders of Iran, then he may very well end this war right now. And I think that's a pretty good heuristic.
Billionaire afterwards going to work in Silicon Valley. So we have all of those. Just let's talk about that. We won't talk about their intelligence capabilities, their Air Force, anything else. Just everything that comes from their cyber capabilities. That is all 100% at the use put at the service of the United States. Because they are small and vulnerable. So they have these outsized talents. They do whatever we tell them. Tucker wants you to believe that the Mossad is manipulating Americans. Mossad is, Candace Owens wants us to believe that Mossad is trying to kill her, as if she's that important, as if they don't have better things to do. The other thing about Israel is it's small. It's small, and their intelligence services are incredibly focused. They are, I know this from my time in the government, they are not focused on anything going on in the United States. Nothing. Zero. It's not happening. They're not even focused on a country like Turkey. I happen to know this as well. They're not collecting on they're not collecting on Turkey here. Every other week in the Turkish press, there are Mossad agents arrested here, Mossad agents arrested there. They are focused like a laser on the existential threat to them, which is the Iranian nuclear program. That's where all of their resources are focused, and they will do whatever we tell them. And this is.
There's a fairly objective observer who I follow closely with regard to Iran, and she's in Argentina, I believe, or Brazil. Her name's Patricia Marins. And she asked, I think, a key military question here. This makes sense to me. What runs out first, the US-Israel interceptors or Iran's ability to launch missiles? This is a key reason why I don't know if this war is a good idea or not. So right now, according to what we know, the US-Israel interceptor stocks are far closer to running out than Iran's ability to keep launching missiles at scale. So Iran has thousands of missiles, probably still has hundreds of launches. Right now, the evidence is that Iran can sustain these missile launches far longer than Israel and the United States can sustain interceptions at current rates. So in this attritional sense, it seems like Iran has a significant advantage. There's a popular line of analysis on this war is that it's all about China, that Beijing has spent billions of dollars building Iran into an asset, and Trump is picking off China's assets one by one. First, he picked off Venezuela, and now he's taking Iran out of the equation, and Trump is dismantling these pillars of China's regional architecture. And I think this is a serious argument. Right? Iran is not merely a nuisance, it is a Chinese asset. So degrading Iran may well degrade China's power, because China does buy the vast majority of Iranian crude. China has invested heavily, billions and billions of dollars in Iran. There is attrition logic here that if the price of oil goes up, that will be terrible for China. On the other hand, Beijing has an opportunistic and transactional relationship with Iran. How difficult will it be for China to buy discounted oil or cheap oil elsewhere? If Iran fractures, maybe China can pivot to whoever controls the oil fields. Beijing has transactional flexibility. There is escalation risk. Right? China will suffer if oil prices dramatically rise, but so do many American allies. So it's not clear that a collapsing Islamic Republic will cleanly translate into greater American strategic power vis-a-vis China. It's an interesting question and widely discussed one right now.
Then also, if I keep going on this cyber question, these kids, they come out, they're incredibly good at what they do. They're cyber forces. Then they come out and they participate in Startup Nation, and they create these fantastic startups, which are unable as Israeli companies to go to scale globally. So what do? They sell them to the United States. You see, Google just acquired Wiz, a cybersecurity company. Google didn't do that because the Jews are controlling Google. It didn't do it because the Mossad is manipulating them. It did it because it's a good return on investment. It was a purely capitalist motive there. Every major high tech company in the world has a research and development office in Israel. And all of that research and development ends up being fed back in.
So if you just listen to one Israeli commentator, I recommend this retired General Amir Avivi. He's been consistently ahead of the curve, and this video just came out about an hour ago.
8 in the morning, Israel time. Israel launched a very precise attack on two main sites where the commanders and leaders of Iran were convening, and the result was 40 of the top leaders of Iran were taken out in one attack. This is how it started. That day, Israel conducted 1,200 attacks, while the U.S. Attacked also roughly the same number of attacks. And from that moment onwards, the war erupted in an overwhelming way. Really good start, taking out Khamenei, the leader. And this was the idea, to take him at the very out at the very beginning, understanding that if we don't do so in the first attack, he will probably hide somewhere, and then it will be much more difficult. And since then, we are seeing waves and waves of attacks. Israel announced today that it finally, again, took control of the Iranian airspace. And now our planes are fighting stand-in, meaning they're not shooting from outside Iran. They're flying inside Iran all the way to Tehran, and really controlling the airspace. And this enables a completely different capability of attack. And the moment
Seems it took about 24 hours for Israel and the US to command the air over Iran, which strikes me as a significant development. So is it bad to celebrate the deaths of your enemies? I was reading The Atlantic. Graham Wood began his article on the Ayatollah. Celebrating or calling for the deaths of others is wrong and bad for the soul. I remember I was doing a weekly Torah talk with a rabbi, and he said it's wrong to celebrate the death of your enemy. And it's just so anti-human. I don't like these pretensions to a morality that is not real and is not adaptive. Right? There's no evolutionary reproductive fitness advantage to not feeling good about the deaths of your enemy. A normal American, to the extent that he cares about this Iran war, should feel good that America's enemy is getting pounded. Right? The normal healthy thing is to rejoice in the pain and suffering and death of your enemy, and to feel bad about the pain, suffering, and death of your ally. Right? So this is a status play, and it's this overwhelming perspective from elite commentators. You notice they're all pulled down by the inherent tragic nature of reality and of war and of death, that if you're going to be a high status commentator, you have to look pained. You have to be feeling the tragedy of the death of your enemy. And it's just so bogus. It's such a transparent, phony status play. And it's just another reason why the dominant elite mainstream media just feels so weird, so foreign, so off-putting, so just false to reality. Right? So why on earth do the elite do this? Because it signals that you have great self-control. Because the most natural feeling in the world, most overwhelming feeling in the world, is to rejoice in the death of your enemy. And so the elites want to signal, hey, I'm better than you. I don't engage in this normal human emotion. It's a status boundary. This is how the elite differentiate themselves from the mob, right? We are not like those people who revel in blood. We have souls. We have standards. It comes from this Buffett identity fiction, that what's going on inside of us is more important than what's outside of us. So from the porous perspective, which is the traditional perspective, the conservative perspective, the nationalist perspective, the tribalist perspective, the religious perspective, the most important things in life are outside of you, such as external standards of right and wrong and how you should conduct yourself. And as your primary duty in life is to live up to these external standards, right? That understands the porous nature of reality. Because I believe in porous identity, what's going on with you, what's going on with my friends, what's going on in the community and in America, it affects me. I am not Buffett. The Buffett identity is a fiction, a useful fiction at times, but clearly a fiction. And to think that you can not rejoice in the death of your enemies assumes that there is some reality or should be some reality to this buffered identity, which is absolutely phony. So the buffered identity holds that the most important things in life are inside of you, and you can choose right and wrong, and you can rationally, strategically, autonomously pilot your way through life. And it's just nonsense. The most powerful things driving us are our genetics, our early imprinting, and our alliance structure, right? We get our hero system from our alliance. And it is clearly evolutionarily, reproductively maladaptive not to rejoice in the death of your enemies.
Moment we reach this point, we see also the U.S. enhancing the attacks. And today we heard that the strategic bombers, the B-2, started attacking. They attacked, among other things, also ballistic missile sites, and this is very important. Israel announced that it managed to destroy half of the arsenal of ballistic missiles. We know that we started the war with 2,000 ballistic missiles, roughly. Half of them have been destroyed.
Their
and this is in 2 days.
centers, their air-to-aircraft missiles, and others. These all are possible thanks to the initial attacks by us. We, the Air Force, paved the road to the path to be able to do this in the following days. We are continuing with all force. Citizens of Israel, vis-a-vis.
And Moonman says, if you're not rejoicing in these attacks on Iran, then you don't view Iran as the enemy.
The area, we are aware of your apprehension, and these are very challenging days and very tense ones. Your strength is, your welfare is our highest priority. Please, again I stress, listen and follow the instructions of the headquarters of the rear. Act responsibly. It saves lives.
So another difference that this war may be having in Israel as opposed to Iran is that I would expect that this war is bringing Israel together and fracturing Iran. So the more cohesive a people, the more cohesive a nation, the more powerful it is. And I'd have to think that this war is overwhelmingly bringing Israelis together.
You must know your backing of us. This is our backing. You are the secret of our strength. Together we'll be able to meet every challenge. We'll continue being here with you and update you with every development. Questions? Channel 13. Can you tell us anything? Staying in the bomb shelter is still nevertheless a good idea? Yes, absolutely yes. I tell to all Israelis, listen to the instructions of the headquarters of the rear guard. This has been proven.
So let's think about the different tiers of reaction to this war between high status, mid status, and low status. So high status actors tend to be calm. Why are they calm? Does it come from their superior wisdom? No, it comes from their superior strength, insulation, and embeddedness in power. So because they are protected, they can afford to think in the long run, right? They think in terms of precedent and reputation, and they have a long run perspective because they are protected. Mid-status actors are much more vulnerable. They think in terms of compliance with power, consequence, and their clock runs medium. Low-status people are the most vulnerable. They think in terms of immediate risk because they have the least protection. They operate on a short timetable, right? And those actors who want to exit the alliance, right, they think right now. And so this explains the tone difference between the elite, the mid status, and the low status, right? Because the elite are more protected, they can be more calm, and they can think more about their reputation, and they can think more about the system. The mid status think more about their professional standing and their social standing, and the low status have to think about their immediate survival. So the lower you go in status, the more urgent and emotional people become. And these tiers are situational. So you may have a corporate executive with regard to foreign policy who is high tier because he feels protected, but he may be low tiered on some cultural change if his social world feels exposed. A tenure professor may be high tier with regard to climate change, but mid tier with regard to AI displacement. So people move between tiers depending on the issue, right? High status, low status, medium status. Status is situational. So people with power are at ease with hypocrisy. They just view it as strategy. People with power at ease with contradictions. They just see it as strategy. People with power have no problem condemning something in public and then justifying doing the exact same thing themselves. So the high tier framing on this war is about calibrated strikes and fears of regional quagmires, right? So if a strategy fails, the protected ones, the high status ones, the ones embedded in our institution, they just see the failure as a result of some kind of external, unpredictable complexity that no one could have foreseen. This was the overwhelming American elite reaction to the disastrous 2003 Iraq invasion and occupation. So the elite are embedded in institutions and they react to failure by blaming external causes, the environment, rather than the institution. Now, those in the middle tier, they know that they have to comply with power, and so they obsess over a paper trail. If you work for an institution, you know how important the paper trail is. You don't want to turn on the system, but you may turn on a particular process and claim that the correct rules were not followed properly. Now, those who are most vulnerable, those in the lower tier, right, are going to be the most vindictive, right? We told you this would happen. The elites are incompetent, or the elites are predatory. So Fox News has a low-tier audience. It has a low-status audience. It has a tabloid approach. But it also has elite access. It has massive reach. It has direct influence over policy. So parts of Fox News are high-tier in access and low-tier in audience psychology. CNN has a high-tier, high-status audience, but low-tier access. So status is usually defined by proximity to institutional power. Mid-status is defined by the ability to follow the rules. Low status is defined by your exposure to power. So high-status actors think about precedent and reputation, and they can have a clock that runs for a long time.
So I think everybody in Israel is hoping that the combination of the attack of Israel and the US will enable to really suppress and destroy this capability that is endangering Israel dramatically. Israel managed to hit most of these ballistic missiles that were shot at Israel. Yesterday it was 200. And also today, all day, we had ballistic missiles shot at us. Yesterday there was a direct hit in Tel Aviv with a woman that was killed and people injured. And today, Moshe, you live in Bet Shemesh. You know that better than anybody, a devastating attack in Bet Shemesh, a missile that hit directly a house and a shelter. So far, 9 people killed, among them children, more than 50 injured. Terrible, terrible attack. Very, very tragic, very sad. But it also sends us a clear message how dangerous these ballistic missiles are, what a danger they pose to Israel, and why Israel views the production of ballistic missiles as an existential threat.
So probably something like 90% of Israel supports this attack.
It's done a massive amount. I think every single person in the world should see the result of this Iranian attack.
And the chat says this might explain the US-European difference. Iran doesn't care about Europe, and Europe doesn't care about Iran, but Iran has declared the US the enemy and is actively sabotaging US interests. Right. So the world works on an alliance basis, and you really can't be neutral for very long in the world, because if you're simply friends with someone who's under attack, you will inherently become attacked.
They are targeting civilians on purpose. They're shooting centers of cities in order to cause as much casualties as possible. And one more reason why we need to annihilate this regime completely. And this is what we're going to do. At the end of the day, this regime is not going to stay. The IDF, on one hand, is attacking fiercely all these ballistic missile sites and launchers. But at the same time, now the IDF is attacking the centers of government. It's attack.
So this polarization intensity is explained by these different tiers of status. You've got a high tier actor. They are going to minimize mistakes made by the institution that protects them. They're going to minimize the dangers created by institutional actions. And for people in the middle to lower tiers, this will be experienced as indifference to their exposure. So Trump voters overwhelmingly come from low to middle tiers of status, and the people in power overwhelmingly come, obviously they're high status and they come from the left. Low tier actors, because they're more vulnerable, they're going to have much more intense rhetoric and emotions, and people who have high status will interpret that as destabilizing the coalition and justifying more power needed for the elites to control the unruly low status masses.
All these headquarters were from there. The Iranian forces attacked the Iranian people. So we're trying to really dismantle this infrastructure that has been butchering the Iranian people and attacking them. While
So who gets to speak? Who gets to narrate what's going on? So for people with high status, they want to, as much as possible, limit speech, limit freedom of speech to those with high status who are embedded in institutions. And narrative authority is an enforcement tool that the elite want to wield. They want to decide whose speech counts, and credible means aligned with an institution. Extremist means disobeying institutional directives. Nuance means containing. And misinformation means we've got a rival narrative here that is damaging to our power. So who gets to narrate what's going on with this Iran war? The high status people say, that, look, we can manage this. We're using deterrence. This is all tragic. It's necessary. We're using calibrated escalation. We've got this under control. The lower tier feel exploited and in danger. So when a lower tier person tries to describe and narrate what's going on in the Iran war, they'll likely be told by the high status, stay in your lane. When a high tier person starts talking about institutional mistakes or danger, they'll be told that they are destabilizing the institution, right? When a mid-tier person asks for coherence in this policy, they'll be told to stop overthinking. So here's a reusable template that you can apply to any breaking news story. What happened? Who spoke first? Identify the tiers, the high, middle, and low tier. What are they protecting? What risk are they responding to? What is their cost of being wrong? Their tone will signal their position. What can't they say? What is their authority? And based on the incentives, what's the forecast? So what happened? We've got a war with Iran. Who spoke first? The Trump administration. What are the high status, high tier responses to this war? Presidential briefings, national security spokespeople, UN ambassador, senior think tank analysts. That's the high tier. Mid-tier, network and cable news hosts, midget newspaper policy desks, fact-checking segments. Low tier, talk radio, live streams, podcasts, independent newsletters, Substacks, YouTube commentary, which will focus on risk, betrayal, incompetence by elites. Now, what are the various sectors protecting? Right, the people with the most status are the most embedded in institutions, and they are most intent on protecting the institution that is protecting them. Right, they want to frame this war as legal and normal and rational. Right, they want to frame this war as just responding to threats and moving towards laudable long-term goals such as nuclear non-proliferation or regional stability. Middle tier commentators will want to talk about the coherence of the official narrative. They will want explanations for when it doesn't cohere. They want explanations for how this fits into established norms on war powers and regulatory processes. The lower tier wants protection from immediate harm, such as inflation, draft risk, terror. They'll have a much more emotional framing of what's going on, and they will critique the elites for disregarding the ordinary people and for disregarding the dramatic effect on the economy and on oil prices. So for the high tier, what risk are they responding to? Their status, their institution that protects them. Can they manage danger within the existing framework of their institution? The mid-tier wants to know, does this cohere? Does this align with past promises, rules, and expectations? The lower tier is asking, will this harm me or the people I care about? So what is the cost of being wrong? The high status, the institution could lose credibility and power and diplomatic leverage. The middle tier is worried about losing professional trust. The lower tier is worried about actual physical, economic, and social harm. So what does the tone reveal about their status? So those with the most power sound the most calm. They talk about law and precedent, calibrated response. They have expertise, that they know things that you don't know. The middle tier wants explanations and coherence. And the lower tier are worried about risk, unfairness, danger. What cannot be said? The high status, they cannot say that there's anything wrong with the institution that protects them. They cannot say the system is broken. They cannot say that their leaders have intentionally misled the public. Right? The middle tier cannot say that the rules are meaningless because their whole job is to enforce the rules. And the lower tier, who are the most exposed, cannot usually narrate a nuanced take because they have much more exposure and vulnerability. So credibility in the high tier comes from being aligned with official sources and institutions. And people in the highest tier will say, you have to listen to us. We know things that you don't know. And anyone who questions what we're saying is irresponsible. So the higher tier will keep protecting the institution. The Trump administration will keep using coalition management language. The middle tier will focus on oversight, coherence, process, implications. Lower tier will be the most hysterical, vulnerable, worried about social, economic, and physical harm. So the high tier most wants to protect its legitimacy. So the goal here is not some kind of primitive regime change, but we want to degrade command and control. We want to remove the technical capacity to threaten regional instability. We want to create conditions where Iran must recalibrate its behavior or face internal fragmentation. We're all about altering the incentive structure of the Iranian leadership. We're not just moving lines on a map. Middle tier will say, well, the historical precedents, such as the 2003 Iraq invasion and occupation, that's misapplied. They lack the precise legal and coalition framework we have now. So these strikes follow, well, if they follow a clear mandate and a target, then it's good as long as we're following the law, the rule of law, as long as we're following the correct procedures, that's what's important. So the more insulated you are, the more calm. So the highest tier, the highest status will be the trailing indicator. So once you have high status actors embedded in institutions saying this war is a disaster, right, that is huge, right? They will be the last to feel the material cost of a mistake. So they're the trailing indicator. The low tier hysteria set, they will usually be the leading indicator because they are more vulnerable to the vibrations of the system breaking before that data reaches the highest tier dashboard. So the alarmism of the lowest tier is a sophisticated high-speed scanning mechanism for existential risk. So that's why it's worth paying attention to Tucker and to Steve Bannon and to Breitbart.
Their neighbors in the Gulf, they are further accelerating their own demise because now you're seeing a lot of these Middle Eastern countries aggressively standing up and pushing back. And so, yes, the threat is real, it's present, but it's going to be one that's going to have to be addressed at a very personal level, almost say by street, as we try to uproot these sleeper cells across the world.
Yeah, you know, it's everything becomes political here at home, but with the politics at play and so much coming, what would you say about, or directly to the American people about this operation and how historic it actually is?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the 1979 hostage crisis and the wave of international terrorism that it unleashed. You know, radical Islamic terrorism has its inspiration for direct action really from this revolution. So if this regime can be finally turn the page on to a different, more positive future, I think we also see the potential for the demise of this religiously inspired radical Islamic terrorism at the same time. It won't be completely gone, but one of the largest beneficiaries or protagonists of this is the Iranian regime that we're seeing right now, lashing out at everyone in its final gasp of life.
Do you have confidence that all of the push toward a nuclear weapon starts to go away by taking out the Ayatollah and his commanders, his inner circle?
No guarantees. It's still too early. Taking away the capability and the capacity, like the bombing last summer, Midnight Hammer, and what's unfolding now is necessary. But until the nature of this regime in Tehran is changed to one that's willing to live peacefully with its neighbors, treat its people with respect, and actually honor what's in their best interest, it will always be a threat. And so hopefully the Iranian people are given an opportunity to take back their country, put it on a more positive path.
Brent.
So let's apply this model to this war in Iran. So those with the most status, those embedded in our military and political institutions, right, they said, well, this was necessary. This is a moment of opportunity for the Iranian people. They'll use calm language like major combat operations and eliminating immediate threats. So they maintain the fiction that this is a controlled surgical event. And what they most want to protect is their own power and their own systems and their own institutions. Right? To admit that this could lead to a 30-year regional quagmire would say that their model and their institution have failed. So they use calm rhetoric to signal to their allies and to the financial markets that adults are in the room. These strikes are a declaration of justice to keep the institutional coalition from panicking. Right, the mid-tier response, right? They are obsessed with coherence and process. This is the Gang of Eight. Was the War Powers Resolution followed? Is America following the rules? Right, they're not arguing about the war itself. They're arguing about the process, the way it was started. They are focused on the rules. Right, if the president can simply launch a full-scale war, then the mid-tier's expertise in process is useless, and everyone wants to preserve their power. So the middle tier is confused right now. They're trying to reconcile the magnitude of this event with the lack of following regular procedure. And those who are most vulnerable are the most alarmed. Right? They're focusing on gas prices and on disasters that could wreck their lives. So the high tier narrators are the people in the White House and the Pentagon and the ambassadors and the major think tanks. And they're the ones who talk about manageable escalation and degraded capabilities and counter-proliferation success and opportunity for the Iranian people. You have to be high status, buffered, and protected to speak this way. And then the lower tier, the Breitbart crowd, the Tucker Carlson crowd, is talking about crisis and betrayal and evil.
Dealing also with the military sides. The U.S. also started attacking the Iranian Navy, and we know that at least one ship was sunk. Iranians tried to close the Hormuz straits. This is not something acceptable, and I believe that the U.S. will deal with this and will attack.
So obviously, I'm not an Iran expert. I'm not a war expert. I do know something about cliches. I do have an above average ability to spot cliches. And one cliche that we're likely to get with regard to this war is the rally around the flag effect, that if you bomb Iran, that's only going to make the Iranian people rally together and support the Islamist regime. And I think it's a cliche, and I don't think it's necessarily true. If you sufficiently hate the regime, you have numerous incentives to welcome the death of a regime that you feel oppresses you. So I don't think it's clear that there's going to be some kind of massive rally around the fact. And I think the large number of protests against the regime over the previous months showed that there was not some kind of sustained rally around the flag effect from the 12-day war. And another cliche that I don't think is necessarily going to be true is, oh, you can't do a regime change through an air war. And if you take out enough people in power, right, you are changing the regime. Now, have you changed it sufficiently so that it is more friendly to the United States? That's the question, and it's not at all clear. So I'm not taking a stand on whether or not this attack is a good thing. I am taking a stand against cliches and sloppy thinking. So there may be a developing symmetry between military pressure and internal dissent. I think it's conceivable, I think it's possible that an air war might destroy the primary tools of repression, and it might empower a domestic opposition to take the final steps towards change. You may have such a degradation of economic, logistical, political, and Islamist infrastructure that the Islamist regime can no longer effectively govern. So the use of air power doesn't have to produce an orderly democratization. Perhaps it only needs to break the monopoly on force held by the current regime. We have had air campaigns that led to power vacuums. We may have a power vacuum in Iran.
So far in Israel, we have some understanding of what are the targets Israel is shooting, because the IDF is sending footage and talking about the attacks. We have less knowledge of the American attacks because the US is not releasing a lot of information.
So prior to 9/11, Donald Trump was not popular. And then after 9/11, George W. Bush, the President George W. Bush, was not popular. After 9/11, he briefly became highly popular. And so Americans did unite after 9/11. But it's not necessary that a nation unites under an external attack. This situation, right, might be different from that rule. Rally around the flag is not an automatic human response. It's a human response under certain circumstances. Luke is back from 2 weeks helping plan the Iran gambit. Stay in your Iran lane, says the chat. But how many Iranians would welcome a foreign invasion? It would depend. So think about Germany. Those people who hated Hitler likely welcomed an invasion of their country. Those people who loved Hitler hated an invasion of their country. So Iranians are not one thing. There are all these different interests in Iran, and I think it's entirely conceivable that there won't be a profound, lasting rally around the flag effect. I think it's possible that the Islamist regime may be so sufficiently destabilized that you get a different political structure in Iran. Didn't the Iranian protesters try to do a color revolution, install a monarch? Yes, they tried. And apparently tens of thousands of them were slaughtered. And that isn't necessarily the end of things, right? The future is not yet written.
Guard have been killed, along with the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khameini. Celebrations of that news have broken out around the world, including here in Washington's Georgetown neighborhood, where demonstrators marched with U.S., Israeli, and pre-Islamic Revolution Iranian flags. We have Fox News team coverage with Aisha Hasni at the White House and Chief Foreign Correspondent Trey Yingst in Tel Aviv. Trey, we start with you.
Shannon, good morning. More Iranian ballistic missiles soared through the skies of Israel this morning, triggering air raid sirens across the country. At least 9 people were killed in the community of Beth Shemesh outside of Jerusalem, more than 20 wounded. You can see in these live images, first responders are still combing through the scene, looking for survivors or other people who may have been killed. Similar scenes overnight in Tel Aviv, where an Iranian ballistic missile slammed into a residential block. We arrived there as many crews were digging.
Let's look at the dominant media frames on this war. So the elite media, represented by the New York Times, BBC News, and Reuters, will focus on process. Were the correct processes followed? They'll focus on expertise, right? They'll say this is a high-stakes security crisis driven by nuclear concerns. Donald Trump did not have to do this. He has gambled. We'll have experts debating escalation ladders with an emphasis on proportionality and legality and global stability. And the tone will be grave and procedural. And it will be heavy on former generals and think tank analysts. And the subtext will be trust the institutions, but worry about process and miscalculation. Worry about uncontrolled escalation. Blind spot will be little sustained discussion of regime legitimacy or internal Iranian factional politics. The U.S. right-leaning media, as embodied by Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, they will frame this war as overdue confrontation with evil. Iran has waged a shadow war against America for decades. Deterrence has failed. Past presidents were weak. Donald Trump is using strength, and that will restore order. So you'll have a tone of moral clarity, resolve, and warnings against appeasement. Blind spot, limited discussion of what comes after these strikes. The Israeli security establishment frame, Haaretz, and Israeli TV security commentators, they will focus on existential risk. Nuclear Iran is an intolerable threat. Preemption is tragic but necessary. If you want to be a high-status commentator, you got to put forward that tragic but necessary frame. You have to be sober and pained. So the tone will be sober, pained. It's all about tragedy, and this is fatal and fatalistic, and we have to be conscious of history. And we've learned from history that waiting can be fatal. It's better to act too early than too late, but it's sad and it's fatal and it's tragic. Then you'll have the Iranian state media say this is imperial aggression. The tone will be defiant, nationalistic, and moralized. Al Jazeera will worry about regional spillover, conflict engulfing the region, oil markets, refugee, proxy militias. The tone will be alarmed. You have a dissident frame. The public is being managed, that intelligence claims are being put forward without any verification, that elites are driving an escalation that is against the interests of the American people. The tone will be suspicious, anti-establishment. So all of the major forms of media will follow coalition signaling. So Western institutional media will ask, are we following the process? Is the system functioning responsibly? Are we aligned with international law? Security hawks will ask, are we strong enough? Are we resolved sufficiently? The Iranian state media will ask, are we united against outsiders? Regional Gulf media will ask, will this destabilize us? Alternative media will ask, who benefits from this narrative we're being fed? So the high status tier, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, they will emphasize institutional legitimacy, experts, escalation management, alliance cohesion, international law. They will talk about this is a complex security dilemma. Intelligence assessments suggest X. Officials weigh proportional responses. Allies are consulted. Tone will be grave, responsible, managerial. Because high-status Americans feel protected by institutions. They assume the system works, that the system is rational. They fear disorder and reputational damage. They want adults in the room.
To strike preemptively, and that the president decided not to let U.S. forces absorb those attacks from missiles. Back here at home, most Republicans do back the operation, Shannon, but the majority of Democrats say this war, these strikes are illegal, and they are demanding a vote on a war powers resolution as early as this week.
Donald Trump is taking the United
Wow, war. Is this legal? Is this illegal? Right? Not my primary concern. But for those people who are all about process, right, that's going to be their primary concern. So what frightens high-status Americans embedded in our institutions is the erratic, wild, dangerous rhetoric of the low status. The mid-status forms of news are CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, right? They will emphasize narrative clarity. They want to put forward heroes and villains. Is there strong leadership? Is this reckless chaos? Is the president restoring deterrence? Or is the president dragging us into another endless war? They will focus on panels and rapid reaction and emotional conflict. The tone will be anxious but performative. Lots of outrage or pain or tragedy or praise depending on whose ox is being gored. So mid-status Americans are not running institutions, but depend on institutions. So they take cues from high-status signals that run our institutions. They want stability and clear direction and following the process. Low status, talk radio, independent YouTube live streams, likely to focus on betrayal. We were told these lies. Who profits from this war? The emotional tone will be anger, suspicion, and dark humor. Because the people promoting these narratives usually will not feel protected by the system. They'll feel that America's alliances are not serving them, that this is not some kind of abstract chess match, that this is a clear and present danger.
Do you see U.S. troops could end up in Iran, boots on the ground?
One I'd like to see, it's actually right here, and that's Karg Island. And Karg Island is 80% of the oil that comes out of Iran comes through Karg Island. 20% of that comes through the Straits of Hormuz. That's another place you could put troops out there. And 15% of that oil goes to China. So if you really want to disrupt the flow of oil, maybe you want to put boots on the ground. It goes back to what Fehrenbach said.
So you'll have the same event and different people will react to it differently. So high status Americans may well read Haaretz, the elite Israeli New York Times equivalent publication, to understand Israeli strategic thinking, or they may follow BBC News for international reaction. I like to leave BBC News running all night because I find the English accent, upper class English accent, calming. Mid-status viewers will look at clips from Al Jazeera and interpret them through a partisan and tribal lens. Low-status consumers may circulate segments from press TV in Iran, not because they trust Tehran, but because it disrupts the dominant U.S. narrative. So the same missile strike, right, will be seen by the high status as some kind of calibrated deterrent move or a reckless escalation or a racket benefiting corrupt elite insiders. So your interpretation of this war will depend less on the facts and more on whether you feel protected, anxious, or exposed. And think about why we get so many news stories about the threat of AI. It's because journalists have a lot of anxiety about AI, not because wider Americans, right? Looking at polls, Americans are wary of AI, but they're not enraged, they're not frightened, but journalists are frightened by AI. Highly educated media workers are focused on AI. They're all about doom narratives about AI, and they interpret any story regarding AI through this doomer lens because they are so frightened for their own status and power. The value of credentials and status and where you went to school, right, drops considerably as we move more towards a merit and algorithmic economy. So how people frame AI depends on what coalition they're from. Right? If AI overwhelmingly serves you and your coalition, you're going to be down with it. If it threatens your status and power and income, you're going to put forward a doomer narrative, particularly if you're a journalist and that aligns with your best interests. So all the AI doomer narratives that dominate the news do not reflect the perspective of Americans as a whole, right? They reflect the interests of the particular media class.
Well, Keith Kellogg, General, great to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so let's start here. These are the reported strikes that we know about this joint operation with the U.S. and Israel across Iran. Now, these are our assets in the region. We know Iran is returning fire in a lot of these places, or attempting to.
Yeah, first of all, you got to back off a second and realize how big Iran is. You know, Iran is bigger than any state except Alaska. It's 2.5 times the size of Texas. So for this operation to unfold the way it is, with the strikes occurring and with the assets we're using, is really quite amazing to me. People have to kind of realize this is big.
Size.
This is really hard to do. And we've done an exceptional job, and President Trump's done a great job. So when you look at these strikes out here with the fleets out here, with the 2 carrier strike groups, one here and one in the Mediterranean, and combined with the...
So one silly thing that I notice in elite discourse is how literal it is. And there's this widespread media assumption, an elite assumption, that because Iran was negotiating, that meant something, that Iran was therefore negotiating in good faith. But there's no reason to believe that Iran was negotiating in good faith. But our elites are embedded in institutions and systems that reward procedural rationality. So if there is a negotiation channel, the elite default assumption is to treat it as real because their entire professional lives are built on the premise that these procedures are real. right? Diplomacy is their native language. So if you assume bad faith, right, you risk looking unserious or impulsive if you have high status. Right? If you assume good faith and you are wrong, you can just say, oh, we tested the diplomatic track. That is much safer for your reputation. So from the outside, there was never much reason to believe that Iran was negotiating with good faith. But when you look at the media and the elites, there's outrage that Donald Trump would bomb Iran while negotiations were going on, as though these negotiations meant something. All right, people don't say what they mean. With rare exceptions, people rarely mean what they say.
Israelis, it's really quite impressive to me, the amount of attacks that have been going on and the areas we have to protect as well.
So is there any scenario in which you see U.S. troops could end up in Iran, boots on the ground?
One, and assets that we see right now. So right now, except for those 2 points, I would say no, not at all.
Okay, let's look at the range of what Iran's got. This is the current range that we know of. We know they've been trying to expand this, but that's still pretty significant throughout that region.
Well, it really is, but we're kind of in the process of dismantling that whole system. There was a lot of fear before about their missile fleet, and understandably so, what they've got out there. But every day that goes by, we're slowly but surely diminishing that threat to the allies that we have in the region and also far out there. And I think Pete Hegseth has done a great job, Secretary of War, and Dan Kane, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, are doing a great job making sure that that threat doesn't happen. We're not out of the woods yet. We're only in day 2 of this, and there's going to be time to do it. But every day that circle gets smaller and smaller.
Okay, and you mentioned this. I want to talk about the naval assets we've got in the region. Right. You talk about the importance of the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump has talked about completely decimating their Navy. That's what he wants to do because of all of the interest in the region.
Yeah, so just because Iran or any party sits for negotiation doesn't mean it's in good faith. Just because people wear a uniform doesn't mean that that uniform represents who they really are. Just because people use certain rhetoric doesn't mean that that rhetoric represents what they're all about. And just because an institution has a website that says that they have the following values doesn't mean that there's any reality to those claims. So rhetoric, uniforms, websites, procedures, right, do not necessarily reflect something real.
And here's what we have. That's quite a buildup.
Yeah, it is. It's really quite a...
Just because I might wear a Dak Prescott jersey does not mean I'm Dak Prescott. Just because Iran is sitting down for negotiation doesn't mean that they are interested in negotiating.
Amazing. When you look at the size of the forces we've got out there, it's massive. He really doesn't, he meaning the Iranians and Larijani, who's the current leader.
Mm-hmm. It's just the stupidest thing in the world to take people at their word or to say, oh, you know, this person is dressed like an Orthodox Jew, therefore I know XYZ about them. Right? This person is following apparently this procedure, or this person has a website, or his institution has a website that says XYZ. It means nothing. The things that people say bear little parallel usually to what's really going on. It's just remarkable that mature, intelligent, successful, embedded, high status people seem to take other people at their word. It's among the most ridiculous things. Nobody can dictate to a country what they will do with their people and lands unless they have the power. Guess what? The strong do what they want and the weak endure what they must. That's the way the world works. That's the way the world has always worked. I suspect that will be the way the world will always work. Right? If the United States says that they're going to war to defend freedom and democracy, it doesn't mean they're going to war to defend freedom and democracy. The U.S. uses all sorts of elevated language, and many highly educated elites use very elevated moral language that doesn't necessarily have much connection with reality.
By the way, I give him a beach house in Namibia right now, get him out of the country. Right now, his assets are slowly being diminished. They really don't have a Navy. They're trying to control right here the whole Persian Gulf area and to really control the Straits of Hormuz. So when you asked me earlier where I'd do it, I'd control both the Straits and Kharg Island.
I love the TV show The Pitt on HBO, but it venerates expertise. It's all doctors know best, experts know best, and it's always pushing the ideology of the expert class, including how awesome it is to facilitate assisted suicide, and how awesome it is for Jews and Muslims to come together, and how awesome it is to be a part of the coalition of the fringe as against the Christian nationalist center of this country. And I think pretty much every medical show is the same way. It's all about expertise and competence under chaos, that the doctors are right, that following the hierarchy is right. It's always advancing this expert class ideology.
Once you control those two, you really diminish economically his ability to do something. And I don't think the threat, every day that goes by, the threat will get lesser and lesser and lesser. And I've got to give it to Dan Kane. And they've got a great plan. And the Secretary of War's got a great plan with Pete Hegseth. They're doing a great job. The president's taking tremendous courage to do what he's done. So when you look at these assets out there, we've used them quite well.
All right. Well, we are in just day 2, as you said, General. Thank you for stopping in to give us your perspective.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Joining us now, Senator Tim Kaine, member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, as lawmakers continue to react to developments, you're going to hear from the other side of the aisle. Senator Dave McCormick, a veteran himself.
I really don't care what politicians have to say about the Iran war or pretty much anything else. I find them the most boring people. Now, you can understand why high-status people are boring, because they have the most protect, and they are the most embedded in institutions, and there are the most ramifications for their words, right? My words don't have much ramification because I have a tiny following and I'm not embedded much in any alliance, coalition, or institution. The more responsibility you wield, the more incentives you have to be very careful what you say, which makes you boring to listen to.
Information about what they're doing, but we know that they're conducting massive attacks, including also, of course, the strategic capabilities of the B-2. I think that it will take possibly a day or two to really understand the magnitude of the attack and understanding really what was achieved. I don't think the regime will be able to sustain this for long. We are really destroying systematically all their capabilities. And after we took control of their airspace, now it's waves and waves and waves of attacks conducted by Israel and the US around the clock. Israel and the US for months have prepared thousands and thousands of targets. There is a very, very clear, systematic plan how to dismantle and destroy all the capabilities of the regime, and this is exactly what's happening.
Okay, let's go to the chat. Haven't seen any TV coverage before now. Shocking to realize what a super medium for war it is. Yes, war looks very exciting on TV. Did I hear David Starkey's interview with novelist Lionel Shriver? No, I haven't seen that. Killing the leader is rough. Is there any indication the Iranian people will follow through with regime change? No strong indication as yet. The Iranian regime has ruled with the support of only about 20% of the population, and has been able to do that for decades. So the justification for this war, and pretty much every war, will depend upon unverifiable expert claims. So the more advanced an economy, the more things are going on in that economy that are only understandable to other experts. So expertise creates this black box where the public can't hold experts accountable because we don't understand what's really going on. We lack the knowledge, the tacit knowledge, the knowledge that is unwritten, experience-based, and impossible to codify. So we have military and intelligence experts claiming all sorts of things, and we simply cannot access the basis for their claims. We always have to operate in a state of epistemic inequality. We are asked to trust the experts' feel for the situation. So more and more of life in advanced economies is transferred out of the control of the people and their representatives to an increasingly unaccountable expert class. And the further you go left on the political spectrum, the more they want rule by experts. So communism wants more rule by experts than socialism. Socialism wants more rule by experts than, say, just liberal, moderate leftists. So tacit knowledge means knowledge that cannot be codified and written down. So it's local, it's particular, it's habit-based, and it doesn't transfer very well. So in large part, we're going to war on the basis of tacit knowledge that we cannot assess. So the theory of our governing democracy is that we elect representatives who then talk and come to agreements, but we didn't have any kind of widespread deliberation for this war. We just had the Trump administration making claims and then launching a war. And it was done on a synthesis of expert claims that we cannot verify and analyze. And experts love perpetual horizons. Right? They only pay attention to information that fits their pre-existing worldview. And that probably explains why the first 2 days of this war confirmed the priors of every single expert. Do you know a single expert on war or on Iran or on the Middle East who has not had their priors confirmed by the first 2 days of this war? And think about the incentives, right? It's so exciting and you get so much more power and status if you advocate for intervention overseas as opposed to not intervening overseas. Once the war begins, experts will be looking to confirm their priors. Right? Any problems, any internal instability will be cited as evidence that the Iranian regime was on the brink. So the claims underlying this war are classified. So the public does not get access to any disconfirming evidence. The Gang of Eight, US senators, does not merely restrict information, it spreads ownership across the Gang of Eight. So they are incentivized to take the same position. High status experts, high status officials will converge around a shared vocabulary of red lines, escalation dominance, regime stability. Right? It signals their membership in a strategic high status community. Their expertise has become a social property. It shows authority. We're in a state of crisis, and the ordinary rules simply get thrown out the door when we're in a state of exception. And how could we falsify any of the claims that led to this war? And we have expertise creep, because experts are incentivized to try to get more and more power and status and prestige by exaggerating how much they know. The experts behind this war are incentivized not merely to echo one another, but to perform consensus for one another, to use the same vocabulary and the same arguments. And they are largely insulated right now from the rest of the world outside the expert class. They only get audited down the line in history. And each successful use of this black box justification for war lowers the threshold for the next use. So we have this expertise creep from narrow threat assessment into a sweeping political prophecy. Then we have all these allied commentators performing consensus through shared jargon to signal their membership in this elite group rather than evidence. And falsifiability is quietly delegated to a future history will judge. And that history arrives only after the facts on the ground have been altered by the act itself. Open source signals are downgraded to noise the moment the experts speak. Institutional memories survives every past failure by reapplying the same tacit scripts. Data is withheld while the bombs fall. Every successful invocation of this unverifiable authority claim lowers the bar for the next claim.
We see, by the way, the regime really acting in an hysterical way, shooting not only Israel, but shooting all the countries in the Gulf. They are shooting Qatar, the Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones are being shot at different countries, maybe in order to create some kind of pressure on the US, but it's really creating exactly the opposite. Saudi Arabia is more and more siding with Israel and the US, saying that they support a change of regime. We haven't heard that before. Of course, the UAE is also very upset and Kuwait about the shooting in their countries. And it's becoming more and more clear that this regime poses a big threat not only to Israel, but the whole region and beyond.
Thank you, General. I'm curious if you can kind of compare this to the 12-day war of last year and how, the aspirations of this war seem to be much greater ultimately with the regime change. But is this just a bigger 12?
So why are the high status players in this game so pained? Right? Why is performing a sense of tragedy and pain such an essential part of the high status pundit? And do you ever tired of this performance of pain and tragedy? Right? Why do the high status need to pretend to care about the pain and suffering of enemies? It's obvious BS. We did not evolve that way. There's no adaptive evolutionary advantage to feeling pain about the demise of your enemies. And why is it that this sense of tragedy and pain just seems to overtake people, right? First, it's performance, and then it becomes a part of their being, and eventually it's a perpetual burden that takes them over. And I particularly see it in high-status liberal Zionist commentators like Micah Goodman or Yossi Klein Halevi, right? The pain that they perform does all this political work. It shows that they're very moral, that they are at the center of these broad moral coalitions. If they sound anguish, right, it signals that they are universalist and liberal and they recognize the humanity of the other side. That widens their coalition. Their sense of tragedy and pain is glue for their coalition. It signals that they are highly responsible. So high status means that you are close to power. And then when your group uses power, you become responsible. And the tragic tone says, we did what we had to do, but we're not celebrating it. It hurts us. When the high status perform pain and tragedy, they are showing we are different from the mob. We are different from ordinary people who rejoice at the demise of their enemies. Right? The mob can afford rage, but we cannot. We must show restraint, reflection, and burden. So our tragedy and our sense of pain, it distinguishes us from the cheering crowd. It's a status marker. It says, I am not driven by impulse. I carry history. Think about Barack Obama. His cadence after every military action was pained, was elegiac. He had power, but he was sorrowful that he had to kill people. So you want high status in the modern liberal world order? You must be visibly ambivalent and pained, have a sense of the tragic. If you are clear and clean and certain, you're primitive. You're backward. You're still clinging to your guns and religion. So why do something so maladaptive as to pretend to care about the suffering of your enemies? Because in elite culture, moral universalism is the currency. You don't have to actually feel this equal empathy in your gut, but you must perform recognition of the humanity of your enemies. And by the way, have you seen my new book, Letters to My Palestinian Mate? It's because I care so much about the suffering of Palestinians, and I'm so pained by the things that Israel had to do to defend itself. Now, there are a tiny number of high-status figures who opt for clarity over tragedy. Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump. That's why Donald Trump hasn't visibly aged nearly as much as Barack Obama and all these other performers of tragedy. It's shocking to elites that Donald Trump enjoys exercising power. So Yossi Klein Halevi, Micah Goodman, Ari Shavit, David Grossman, right? All Israeli liberal Zionists who are so pained about the suffering of Israel's enemies. And then Americans, Barack Obama, Samantha Power, Ann Applebaum, David Brooks, they're always pained about the suffering of their enemies. Pope Francis, Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, Christine Lagarde, They feel such pain and sorrow about the suffering of their enemies. But not so much Trump, not so much Bibi, not so much Naftali Bennett, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel, Smotrich, Ron DeSantis, Tucker Carlson, Tom Cotton. Right? They have high status inside populist nationalist coalitions that are porous and don't depend on this kind of phony, pained performance. Right? They're not pretending to have a buffered identity. They don't have to put themselves forward as warriors constrained by their universal conscience, by their tragic liberal self.
Day war, Israel and the U.S. are hitting more military sites, or is there something dramatically different this time around?
It's very different. First of all, having both countries fighting together side by side, this is a completely different scenario. And the amount of airplanes and capabilities that are being used are on a completely different scale. So is the goal. A change of regime is not attacking some military sites. It's a whole different thing. It's about really eliminating all the leadership. It's about destroying all centers of government. It's communications. It's about the besieged forces. And also, we're talking about revolutionary guards. We're talking about destroying the Iranian Navy, which President Trump talked about. So it's a completely different kind of operation. And what we see is that this time, the U.S. is not calling immediately the Iranians to go out and storm, their centers of government. We don't want to endanger them again and have tens of thousands of people killed. We first want to really degrade dramatically the capabilities of the besieged forces and the revolutionary guards, and dismantle them as much as possible, and only then call for the people to rise and fight for their country. It's obvious that in order to have a regime change, you need, on one hand, this massive attack. On the other hand, you need the Iranian people. You cannot do a regime change without the Iranian people themselves, pushing it and fighting for it. But they need help, and they're getting all the help they need to make it happen.
General, and can you give us an update about the proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis? What is their level of involvement as of right now?
It's very interesting to see that at the moment they're not fighting. Because Mara said if Khameini will be targeted, or if Israel and the U.S.
The Free Press did a live stream shortly after the war began, and here is Haviv Rettig, an Israeli right-of-center commentator.
Exhausting. People are remembering the June war. There's a lot of fear, especially in the big cities that are targeted by the ballistic missiles, the missiles that take 10 minutes to cross from Iran to Israel and are pretty much impossible to stop. There's been some limited successes, and the technology is always improving, but at the moment, Israel can shoot down drones, Israel can shoot down cruise missiles. It's a much more difficult story with the ballistic missiles. And they brought down a couple apartment buildings last time with people in them. And so there's this very real fear. The local governments and the Army's Home Front Command have mobilized medics and, the emergency crews and things like that in preparation for any eventuality. But I think that mostly Israelis are in.
So when you see someone commenting, when you see someone quoted, always ask 4 questions. What coalition do they depend on for status and income? So Haviv Rettig is a Zionist right of center, and he's friendly or also aligned with the MAGA coalition in the United States. So he's an American who moved to Israel. Who do they risk angering if they speak plainly, right? If he says anything that endangers the political rule of the right wing in Israel or America, then he is in danger. Who benefits if his framing wins? The political right in Israel and America. And what truths would cost them their position, right? Pointing out where the right in Israel or United States is doing terrible things, and maybe the left is more rooted in reality. So if you hear an epidemiologist speak during a public health crisis, they're not just an expert in epidemiology. They're embedded in an institution, in a system, in grant systems, in professional bodies, in journals, in regulatory relationships, right? They will have incentives towards maintaining a consensus and moral reassurance, right? A journalist at the New Yorker is not just a neutral observer. They are part of a reputation economy where being early and wrong is punished harder than being late and aligned with status. A dissident academic is not automatically brave or correct. He's signaling to a counter-elite audience. A whistleblower is not just revealing facts. He's defecting from one alliance and seeking protection from another. So that shapes what people will say, what they will reveal, what they will omit. Doesn't mean that truth is impossible. It means that truth is expressed and travels through alliances. So don't treat credibility as an individual trait. Understand it as a network and alliance position, right? Credibility is granted and withdrawn by coalitions, alliances.
In that state of grim determination. You know, this is a regime that has told us for 47 years that we are a cancerous tumor and a little Satan, excuse me. You get to be the great Satan. It's a point of pride to be anywhere in the club that you're invited to, so that's okay. I'll take the little Satan. And they have laid the groundwork in various proxies around us, proxies that have done more damage to their own home countries than to us, Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias and the Houthis of Yemen, for our destruction, for our literal extermination, which they talk about endlessly. And so this has to happen. And I think one view that my neighbors share, because, you know, there's a lot of political disagreements on just about every issue, but one thing that I think Israelis all agree on is that they pulled it off again. This was an astonishing opening to this campaign, and it's quite likely, we still don't know, that Khamenei was taken out. And that's, forgive me for talking too long, but that's really, really important to point this out. And I think...
So if you want to be a high status commentator, you have to come across as calm. Coming across as emotional shows low status. It shows that you're not in control of yourself. It shows that you have a porous identity where the things that are going on outside of you overwhelm your internal resources. So ask one basic question of any pundit, right? Whose coalition does he serve? Right? So Haviv Rettig sits in the Israeli center-right. He has strong English language diaspora reach. He writes for the Times of Israel. He lectures to North American Jewish audiences. He translates Israeli political reality into terms that are comprehensible to the diaspora. So unlike Yossi Klein Halevi and Mika Goodman, he foregrounds Israeli national interests more directly. He's more plain spoken. He's less flowery than those other blokes. He emphasizes Jewish collective vulnerability. He talks about demography, regional threat structure, the logic of state survival. He has a calm tone. He says Israel's wars are not a misunderstanding. They reflect hard conflicts of interest. So I prefer him to the more flowery commentators. He's a journalist. He's an explainer inside a fragmented Israeli public. His currency is clarity and calm. He narrates institutions, parties, demographics, and incentives in concrete terms. His language is less about the sacred and more about the procedural. He's not vague. He's specific. He talks about factions, numbers, constraints, interests. So that narrows his interpretive latitude. That makes him attractive to audiences who value realism over moral uplift. He's not so much a sacred symbol broker. He's not primarily saying this is holy, saying this is how it works. So people interested in policy, institutional literacy, politics, real world, right, will listen to someone like Haviv over the more flowery spiritual speaker.
Neil was mentioning something similar to this at one point, but the very fact that a meeting of Khamenei, the supreme leader, the dictator of Iran for 35 years, the man who built Hezbollah, the man who funded the Houthis, the man who built the nuclear program, this guy, knowing that that meeting was taking place, when and how it took place, within the work hours, right? The daytime bombing is extraordinary because Israel has only really mostly engaged Iran at night. Israeli planes are very good at night. The operational factors are better at night. This was a daytime bombing they did not expect and hasn't happened before. And all these important leaders and advisor on the nuclear program, head of military intelligence, were all in the room. And what that means is the Israelis know when the top, most secretive meetings happen, the most important leadership, the most sensitive leadership, and they know when the meeting is going to happen and where it's going to happen in real time. That alone tells the Iranian regime they are not working together. Somebody is not rowing in the same direction. It breaks the cohesion of the regime. So the psychological impact, never mind the decapitation, which will have to continue for quite a while, but the psychological impact of this kind of a successful start is, it can't be overstated.
Right. And for the listener, what you're saying is clear.
Okay, let's leave it there.